This is an unusual time for the Socratic Club. We usually meet on Friday afternoons once a month throughout the semester. Just to tell you a little bit about the club, we, in a way, have two patron saints. One of them is the namesake of the club, the Socratic Club, and we follow Socrates' maxim to follow the argument wherever it leads, that idea being that reasoned discourse is an important part of a full and complete human life. But we're, while I'm a philosopher and I'm interested in reasoned discourse of any kind whatsoever, in the Socratic Club we're particularly interested in reasoned discourse about the Christian faith, and that's the reason for our second patron saint, who is the famous Christian apologist and author C.S. Lewis, who presided over the Oxford Socratic Club in the mid-1900s, and we take the name of the Gonzaga Socratic Club from the Oxford Socratic Club, where leading luminaries of intellectual life in Britain gathered to talk about questions like atheism and the nature of theism and evidence for theism and miracles and so on and so forth. And we cover something of the same ground here at the Socratic Club, although our primary objective really is to think about the reasonable basis for the reasonable basis for Christianity and the Christian worldview, and also to engage the Christian worldview with the culture that we inhabit. Hence, the topic of our discussion today, which is thinking about Christianity in the light of popular culture. And we've assembled a distinguished panel of faculty members here to talk about this issue. I'd like to introduce them to you at this time. First, we're going to be hearing from Heather Crandall, who is a professor here in the Communication and Leadership program. She earned an interdisciplinary PhD from Washington State and is interested in American Studies, Communication, and Rhetoric, and specifically works on the way media representation and other forms of public discourse influence us as citizens in a democracy. She does work with master's students on their theses and is particularly interested in theorizing communication, visual rhetoric, organizational communication, public speaking, small group communication, and interpersonal communication. So we're pleased to have Heather here. Second, we're going to hear from Michael Orr, who has a PhD over here on the end. Michael Orr has a PhD from the University of Missouri and is professor of communications at one of our sister institutions here in town, Moody Bible Institute. He previously taught at Moody's Chicago campus and at Waldorf College in Forest City, Iowa. At Moody, he teaches a variety of courses, including college writing, research writing, spiritual formation and community, contemporary cultural literacy, and speech communication. And recently, he contributed a chapter to the Moody Handbook of Preaching that was titled Film as a Means for Worship and Illustration. Third, we're going to hear from Matt Rindge, who is a PhD graduate from Emory University and now teaches in the Religious Studies Department here at Gonzaga University. He previously taught at Emory, at Candler School of Theology, and at Columbia Theological Seminary. And here at Gonzaga, he teaches Synoptic Gospels, Bible and Film, and Bible and Ethics. And his first book, titled Illustrating Wisdom, Luke 12:13 through 34, and the Interplay of Death and Possessions, is going to appear in just a few months, right, in April. He's written articles on religion and film for academic journals and also public outlets like the Huffington Post, and is currently working on a book entitled Parables of Disorientation, which considers questions about film critiques of religion in the American dream. And in the Society of Biblical Literature, he also serves on the steering committees for Bible and American Popular Culture and the Bible and Film Consultation Group. Our fourth speaker for the panel today is Eric Cunningham, who received his PhD in modern Japanese history from the University of Oregon in 2004 and currently teaches here in Gonzaga's history department, where he specializes on East Asian and world history. His research interests include modern Japanese literature, Zen Buddhism, Catholicism, eschatology, psychedelia, and film. Isn't it interesting how widely ranging the interests of these guys are? He's published numerous articles on these topics in one book, which came out in 2007, titled Hallucinating the End of History, Nishida Zen and the Psychedelic Eschaton. Every time I hear that title, Eric, I just think, people are going to think, well, what is that all about? They're going to want to know. But the title of Eric's forthcoming book is even more intriguing. It is The Eschaton Zombies of Planet Mu, a meditation on history, film, and the psychedelic meaning of modern Japan. So as you can see, all of our speakers are interested in the question of culture, in the question of popular culture and intellectual culture and how those intersect one another, and in particular, how questions about the nature of Christianity connect to those. So with that introduction, I want to leave us as much time for conversation as we can, so we're going to hear first from Heather Crandall. Thank you.
All right, so I'm part of this panel because of my general interest in popular culture, and it's my hope that I can offer something in the way of a general orientation that we can all use to think about the specialties more specifically on tonight's panel. So culture, right, where you find values, beliefs, behaviors of a group of people. And so in culture, we know and learn what we should and shouldn't do, and what we value, and who we are as people. So to look at Christian themes in popular film becomes interesting because of the values of Christianity up against, or in many cases, and values present in culture, and then amplified in mediated popular culture. And so an analysis of popular culture helps us navigate these amplified meanings and think about how they fit in our lives. And so popular culture comes in forms. So, for example, music or television or radio or sports, and so all of these forms are worth our critical read, and because they tell us something about ourselves and as a culture, but they also tell us something about ourselves in a kind of a funhouse mirror way, right? It's a distorted look at ourselves, and so popular, right? We're talking about popular culture, popular among, 307 million Americans. It's pretty popular among a large number of people. It's pretty amazing. And so you might, like many people, be looking forward to the new reality television show called Bridalplasty. Have you heard of it? Has anybody heard of it? Bridalplasty, new reality show. So what happens is these brides make a wish list of all the plastic surgery that they would like to have done. And then they compete with each other, and one by one they lose, and the winner gets all of the plastic surgery on her wish list. And she gets it on her wedding day, right before her wedding day, so that she can unveil and look just beautiful, right? And so as someone curious about culture, I need to ask, what is going on? So we're not fine, right, the way we are in God's image, but some of us can and should purchase expensive cosmetic surgery and be shaped into culture's current view of beauty, and people watch, right? It's popular, it's there. So as one person said, if you aren't shocked, you aren't paying attention. All right, so I'm going to talk about the tools to look at these forms. And the first one is production. Production analysis. It's a way of thinking about who produces this stuff, right? The fact that 4 or 5 corporations own all of mediated popular culture, that's important to think about. And that those who create it are a similar kind of people. They're mostly male, wealthy, heterosexual, white, and they have to create something. They're charged with creating something that will be popular. So the popularity leads to profit. So there's the profit piece that has to go along with it, or So I was watching an interview with the makers of the new theater production Leap of Faith. Leap of Faith was a movie with Steve Martin in early 90s, and they're doing a theater production of it, and a production decision around this was to add gospel music to it. It didn't have, there wasn't gospel music in the movie, but they've got it in the in the theater production because they think it's going to make it more profitable. So that's, you know, okay, so gospel is now perhaps something that will sell, right? Okay, so another kind of analysis is called audience analysis. Audience endorse what becomes popular, and that's not always in predictable ways. And so, because audience is people, and people are wily, an audience analysis question might ask something: why Touched by an Angel, that television show, had such a long run, whereas Joan of Arcadia, a similar kind of show, had such a short run? That, you know, what's going on that audience is endorsing one and not another? What's happening? Another kind of analysis, the third kind, is textual. In textual, you're looking at content of what is popular, so not the meaning that audience make of it, but what's available there to make meaning with. And so we had a speaker come to campus last year as part of the MA program, and she was from Loyola Chicago, and she is making a documentary about women religious in popular culture, and her research is textual. And so I have a little clip to show you, and you can't see her. You can't see her very well, but you can hear her, and you can see her slides. So I'll just play a couple minutes of it.
Expand it.
A lot of cartoons, and as I said, reading cards. So you've got.
Oh, maybe.
It's the arrows sticking out.
This one?
The next one there. Yeah.
Thanks. So loud. Oh, is it going to buffer? Oh, that's my nightmare.
So you've got a number of different cartoons, usually using some sort of pun around the word habit, but also, again, making fun of nuns for supposedly being either clueless or just draining the fun out of everything. There are films. You've probably seen Sister Act. Perhaps you saw Doubt. They started in the 50s in the United States. A very interesting cultural part of that, because it came after World War II, when all of a sudden Catholicism became sort of popular. And so you had Bing Crosby and Ingrid Bergman, and you had a whole series of very positive depictions of nuns and priests. You have a little bit of hiatus, and then you get this resurgence in not only looking at sisters, but looking at sisters in full habit, even though most don't wear the full habit anymore. So again, this is interesting as well. I mean, Sister Act is particularly interesting to me because these are sisters who are supposed to live in an urban environment, who are going out into schools, and yet they fix them as afraid to go out into the schools. And again, the whole part of the joke is that Whoopi Goldberg is put into this habit. So again, something interesting is going on. In addition to films, there are also plays. Late Night Catechism started in Chicago. A very important musical called Nonsense, in which the nuns again are just sort of daffy and dancing, literally sing and dance around. And then again, of course, nothing's funnier than to see a man dressed as a nun. So we've got that little variation going on as well. So you see then the spectrum, you know, that people feel that they feel free to appropriate the role of the nun, or what they think the role of the nun is, and the garb of the nun, and use it to their advantage. Nothing says this more clearly than the advertising that has used nuns. This is an ad for Blue and Pink from 2009. The theme of this ad is, the overall theme of the campaign is, anyone can do this. So again, a reference to, well, you know, even nuns can do it. How funny is that? Again, they've appropriated the habit, but look at the shoes on these women, right? So again, it's sort of played for laughs. First of all, even nuns can paint, and secondly, I mean, it's not particularly respectful of the habit. They're just going to use it for their own ends. So this gives you an idea of the range of things that I am looking at and talking about. So I tried, this is what I academics do, is to try to start putting them into categories. And the most obvious category to me, well, here's what happened.
And so her documentary will be out, soon. But this is interesting. She looked at what was available in popular culture on the topic of the content of nuns. And so finally, the last type of analysis is historical analysis, and it draws our attention to history, as you can imagine. And so an example that fits with our panel tonight is an article that came out of from a person from Cornell whose name is Lawrence Moore. And he wrote about religion and the culture industry in antebellum America before the Civil War, right? And it was when the penny press was beginning to crank out books, and more people were able to read. And a fantastically popular genre emerged that began to sell, that books began to sell that taught Christian values through detailing raunchy stories of immorality. And so the tales of gambling and drugs and violence and adultery, all page turners, right? So they sell, and then there are books with a moral, like at the end of the story, the lesson is don't do that. Or as this scholar put it, these stories sought to satisfy the curiosity of readers and to remind them that God punished wickedness. And so this begins this genre called moral sensationalism. So you can look way back and see the beginnings of it so long ago. In his words, American fiction, although a poor vehicle to teach dogmatic religion, they tried that, it wasn't selling, was an excellent way to disseminate cultural values that were rooted in Christian views about sin and salvation. And so I would argue that we can see traces of this today, and what I think of is American Beauty. I don't know if you've seen that movie, but in this movie there's a parent of a man, and he has a teenage daughter, and the teenage daughter has a friend, and through the movie there's this kind of sexual tension between the parent and the teenage friend. And in the end of the movie, you see the whole encounter of his fantasy with her, right? And you see all the details of it. And then the movie ends, and I was saying to my friends, like, that was, I didn't really love that part. That, it's against the law. I draw the line there for like something that's entertaining, right? And they were like, but it didn't happen. It was a fantasy. It didn't happen. But yet we saw the raunchy story, right? You see it all. So the narrative tells you it didn't happen, which means you get to dismiss it and it doesn't happen. And so that's just laying the groundwork for different ways of looking at forms of popular culture that hopefully can set us up for the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We're going to hear from Michael Orr next.
My interest has been for some time in probably in your textual criticism. Can the average viewer look at a film, particularly, and I think of my students, since I use film clips in my classes often, they would tell you, how do I help my students really deconstruct a film so if there is value to be found in it, they can find it. And if there's warnings to be found in it, they can identify those things, because I think that's really important. So making every viewer a textual critic rather than just allowing these films to wash over us in some kind of a Friday night entertainment after a good meal. So that's been my concern. But I also, part of it also is this whole idea of how do audiences, how do they begin to do that? How do I help them deconstruct, or how do I direct some suggestions as to how that can happen? So, and I'm also a film viewer. I watch several a week and go to movies often. And though I know I'll often study sort of classical films that are of renown, like Blade Runner or The Searchers or Fight Club, I've seen studies on that. I'm really interested on a lot of indie films that are small films that students can go to where they pick up, and themes that seem to be developed. So one of the themes that I've thought about over the last several years is this theme of alienation and reconciliation in film. And I just want to set the stage in our own setting, cultural setting in right now. I don't have to tell you that there's a growing sense of alienation in our culture. All you have to do is listen to the rhetoric about politics, both at the state and the national level, to realize that people just don't trust each other. and there's just animosity at all sorts of levels. And it's not just in America. You look at France, what's going on in France. There are riots in the streets because the government is trying to be responsible and bring debt under control. And in Germany, after decades of trying to work at multiculturalism with a history that you know of Nazism, Chancellor Merkel just said, multiculturalism in Germany has failed. And so we just see this growing sense of alienation and divisiveness. And is there any hope? And I sense the story of the Chilean miners was a real different story. Here are these guys, 33 men, kept together for 69 days, 2,000 feet underground. And how do they come out? They come out hugging their families. Well, a mistress too, but they hug their families, and they hug the president of the country, and there's just this feel-good unity after 69 days of being in incredible emotional privation. And some of the men even claim that they experienced spiritual renewals while they were down there, and a real sense of camaraderie. And I don't know about you, but I want to applaud those kind of stories. They're real stories, they really happen, and they say something about the hope for humanity in the midst of all that we see. So, and I think filmmakers and screenwriters also have this desire to communicate this idea of reconciliation. St. Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, made quite a claim. He said, "And God is in Christ, reconciling this world into himself, and we are ministers of reconciliation." And in that sense, I think, knowingly or otherwise, many filmmakers are ministers of reconciliation, and that we who have a Christian worldview ought to recognize it, identify it, and celebrate it. Because if positive themes are going to continue to occur in American film, it's because we vote on it with our tickets and our sales. So anyway, so let me suggest that in contemporary film there are a number of levels of alienation and reconciliation that are being recognized and being talked about. One is what I would call intra-alienation and reconciliation, where the person within themselves is experiencing deep conflict, and they're trying to reconcile that. And I don't have to tell you, our society is filled with people that are struggling with inner conflict. Thus, why are suicide rates continuing to stay steady, and drug abuse, and all the things that happen, because people within themselves are struggling. Heath Ledger's death, there's probably a notification of that. Here's a young man who should have everything going for him, and yet something was going on. Anyway, with that in mind, again, these are films that you may have seen, but I saw it in a film called Love Happens. Sounds like a romantic comedy, doesn't it? Jennifer Aniston played one of the roles. But it was really a story about grief and loss. And Burke Ryan, the nationally known grief therapist, is in Seattle doing a seminar. But what we come to realize is that Burke actually has never come to grips with that which sent him on this mission, which is the death of his wife in a tragic car accident where he was in the car. Actually, we find at the end he was driving the car. And it was not until the end of the movie that he breaks down and admits to an audience the guilt that he feels for the death of his wife. And that reconciliation of this tension ultimately brings a familial reconciliation, and ultimately the whole little community of grieving people are also brought together in a special way. We're going to show a scene of that a little bit later, but we'll hold back. I'll say that later. I really had a couple of scenes and I realized I'll never get through in 10 minutes, so we'll say that until the end. The other level is not intra-reconciliation, but inter-reconciliation, and this is very common in film, where two people who are alienated from each other come together. And we see it in a lot of ways, but I want to commit to you a little movie, a little foreign indie film, low budget, that won the Academy Award 2 years ago for the best song. It's called Once. It's what I call a postmodern musical, in the sense there's a lot of music in it, but it's not staged and choreographed. And actually, it's so humble and simple that I almost feel like I'm breaking in on the lives of two individuals that are kind of getting to know each other. But here's what surprised me. This couple, she's a Czechoslovakian, he's from Northern Ireland, and they're getting closer and closer. You think, this is going to turn out into a romantic relationship that perhaps is going to get physical. But ultimately what happens is, just when you expect it to happen that way, they make a decision not to go that direction and instead to return to previous relationships that they had abandoned and trying to make them work. And I had to watch it about 3 times before I said, what was the motivation here? Wonderful film in a lot of ways. And I finally came to the realization that these 2 people, for the first time, maybe in a long time, had a healthy friendship. It was just a friendship, but a good one. And the strength of that friendship made it possible for them to go back to wounded, broken relationships and mend them, at least try to mend them. And I think that's something very commendable about interpersonal reconciliation, and I believe it's true. The third level that I was thinking about is familial reconciliation. We see a lot of that. Little Miss Sunshine, is that the right title there? Yeah, Little Miss Sunshine, a broken, weird, funny family eventually come together because they have one purpose, trying to get the youngest daughter into a pageant. And even though it's weird and twisted, there's just something kind of neat about how the family finally comes together. That familial reconciliation that happens despite all of the potential for conflict. But one that I commend to you that's recent is called City Island. It's a story of an Italian family in the Bronx. And the family basically are so alienated from each other, but here's what happens to bring them together. I think you'll really appreciate this. One of them is asked to do a project for a drama class where they're asked to reveal their darkest, deepest secret to someone else. Ultimately, it leads all the members of the family to share their darkest secrets with each other. And that produces, at the end of the film, a reconciliation that's really quite amazing. And actually, there's a little quote at the end of the film that's about, this is how God works. It's kind of a surprise. So familial reconciliation. And then the last level, I think, is community reconciliation. This is a really ambitious thing, and not a lot of films try to capture it because it's hard to capture community transformation on film. But one that I think is done, one of my favorites in the last several years is called Lars and the Real Girl. And it's a story of a Midwestern town, kind of centered around a little church. And there's this really very broken, alienated young man who is so alienated and needs a relationship that he buys a blow-up doll and pretends that that's his girlfriend. And the community, rather than rejecting him and chasing him out of town, they instead decide to go along with it. So they invite her to parties with him. And they ask him if it's all right if she takes a part-time job at the beauty parlor. And they do all sorts of things. And what ends up, and by the way, the pastor starts this thing going by saying, what do you think Jesus would do? And the result is that they come together as a community, and that coming together community not only unites them, but it ultimately heals Lars, and also heals a relationship that he has with a brother, and they've been emotionally detached for years. So I guess what I want to say in all of these, and maybe let's show the scene, and then I want to talk about how I think perhaps there's a film right now in the theaters that you might see this theme as well.
You'll have to forgive me, I'm not usually a media operator, so.
Hello? Hello, Dad? Captain, that's not a real toilet.
You go to the menu, and
I can't find the menu. It's not pulling it up.
There's remote control.
like a lot of it's a really low budget indie film, you probably see me as the Pardon?
Yeah.
All the wars I saw.
So you should be the,
17.
right.
You can't get enough of her
See what we can do about that. Thank you. Have a seat, please. Gosh, I'm feeling okay. How are you?
Sir, I need to see your badge.
Sorry, what?
Sir, your badge.
I got a badge. Damn thief, you know. Some bitch broke into my house and took some Navy badge.
You can keep this.
We have made a lot of progress in the last few days. But don't forget, it's just a foundation for the future. Excuse me. You know, boys, I'm sorry. I can't lie to you guys anymore. You know, I stand here and I watch you all confront your pain. And I envy you. Because I haven't confronted mine. I didn't want it to be my fault. My wife's accident. It was raining. This dog. In the middle of the road. We had been arguing over paint colors for the kitchen. Paint colors. But what I haven't told you is that I was driving the car. Not her. I killed my wife. I'm so sorry.
It was just an accident, son.
It's his father-in-law.
That's all it was. There was nothing you could have done. No, it's true. It was just one of those freak accidents. Listen to me. We never blamed you. Never. All we really wanted to do was mourn with you, son. We didn't know what to do. We couldn't find you. That's the worst part. It's okay.
screenwriters, who were also the directors, was that this film was birthed in their minds when one of them lost their mother, and the other one was surprised that he wasn't grieving the loss of his mother. And so they started a mutual research project on finding out about grief and loss. And out of that project came this film. And what it says to me is that we don't give film writers and directors and producers enough credit. I know some of them are doing it just for the buck. But, you know, when they've had enough bucks and they have opportunities to do things they really care about, they often do things that are really worthwhile. Martin Luther claimed that our professions can be viewed as the masks of God. And what he meant was that through our skills and our talents and our abilities, that God is able to reveal himself, sometimes subtly, to the people that we serve. And I really believe many screenwriters and directors and producers do that, whether they do it knowingly or not. It's part of their being made in God's image. They can't help but see things they know are right and want to celebrate them with other people. And I think we need to do the same thing by watching films thoughtfully, going to them and telling friends about them, and then supporting them in whatever way we can. Because I think ultimately financially does bring us more. Finances bring us more. May I suggest one film to you that's in theaters right now that I really highly recommend? The film is about a horse named Secretariat, but it's not really about a horse. It's really about a woman who finds herself, and through that, though there's conflict, she ultimately finds reconciliation with her husband and her children, and with a industry that is very jaded. And I would commit it to you as another message of reconciliation. Thanks.
Now we'll hear from Matt.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, it's good.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay.
I'll do more of this.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I want to thank the students and parents and faculty who have come out tonight. There was an advanced screening for the film The Third Miracle that it was about a priest who's sent by the Vatican to investigate a woman who's allegedly become pregnant, but she hasn't had sex with a man, so the claim is that it's some kind of divine pregnancy. And the director did an advanced screening for industry types in Hollywood because he wanted to hear about, do you think that the plot works? Are the characters believable? How's the music? How's the editing? But at the end of the film, he got an hour-long discussion about God, faith, and miracles that he had to put a stop to. And one of my friends who was the music supervisor for the film, Barry Taylor, he said that as far as he knew, he was the only person in that room that had stepped within a church in the last few years. And reflecting on that experience, Barry Taylor said, there is a very, very serious conversation going on in our culture, in Western culture, at the end of the 20th century, about God. And the church is not a part of it. So what I want to do is explore one such conversation in the film Fight Club. How many of you have seen Fight Club? Okay, great. Directed by David Fincher, based on a novel by Chuck Palahniuk, who's a Northwest novelist. That was his first of several novels. Religious language pervades Fight Club. When the narrator, who goes unnamed throughout the whole film, who's played by Edward Norton, describes his experience going to grief recovery groups, he says, every evening I died, and every evening I was born again, resurrected. He later notes, Fight Club wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about words. The hysterical shouting was like tongues, like in a Pentecostal church. When the fight was over, nothing was solved, but nothing mattered. Afterwards, we all felt saved. And language about God is central in one speech that Tyler Durden, played by Brad Pitt, gives to the narrator as he's burning his hand with lye. And Tyler Durden tells the narrator, our fathers were our models for God. If our fathers bailed, what does that tell you about God? You have to consider the possibility that God does not like you. He never wanted you. In all probability, he hates you. This is not the worst thing that can happen. We don't need God. F damnation, man. F redemption. We are God's unwanted children. So be it. Tyler's perspective on God echoes certain biblical texts. In Mark's gospel, the only words Jesus speaks from the cross are these: my God, why have you abandoned me? And these words are significant not only because they're the very last words Jesus speaks in Mark, but also because of what they convey, a sense of utter and complete abandonment by God. This sense of abandonment is likely due to Jesus' prayer the night before in the Garden of Gethsemane in Mark 14, where he asked God to remove this cup of suffering from him. And on the cross, Jesus realizes that this cup of suffering has not been removed. Jesus' question about God's abandonment, my God, why have you abandoned me, is a verbatim citation of Psalm 22, one of many lament psalms in the Jewish Bible. And as opposed to psalms of praise or thanks, lament psalms are characterized by expressions of grief and mourning, blaming God as the source of suffering, accusing God of being absent in the midst of despair, and at times begging God to help. Psalm 88 is a classic example. The psalmist says in Psalm 88, speaking to God, "You have put me in the depths of the pit. Your wrath lies heavy upon me, and you overwhelm me with all your waves. You have caused my friends to shun me. You have made me a thing of horror to them. O Lord, why do you cast me off? Why do you hide your face from me? I suffer your terrors. I'm desperate. Your wrath has swept over me. Your dread assaults destroy me." And then the psalmist concludes the last line saying, "You, God, have caused friend and neighbor to shun me. My companions are in darkness." Many people of faith are understandably uncomfortable with the lament language that accuses and accosts God. Discomfort with Jesus' cry on the cross in Mark, my God, why have you abandoned me?" is the probable reason that in Luke's gospel that line is eliminated, and instead Jesus says, "My Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And it's probable that Luke makes that change because of being uncomfortable with what Jesus says in Mark. In John's gospel, Jesus only says, "It is finished." So in Mark and Matthew, that both have the cry of abandonment, Jesus dies questioning God's absence and questioning God forsaking him. But in Luke and John, Jesus is going to die on a triumphant note of expressing confidence in God's care for him. Discomfort with laments also explains their almost total absence in Christian worship contexts. And, you okay?
I'm fine.
Okay. And explains people running around in inopportune times. And explains the neglect of lament texts like Job, Lamentations, lament songs among Christians. Yet, Hebrew Bible scholar Walter Brueggemann identifies many benefits of laments. He claims that laments allow the petitioner to take initiative with God and thereby become an actual partner in a genuine relationship with God, where God is no longer an aloof, omnipotent being who must be praised. The psychologist Erich Fromm similarly argues that a relationship with God that's characterized by slavish obedience springs from a lack of freedom, a need to please, and a refusal to grow up and become an adult. In this regard, laments can be understood as reflecting a more mature faith development than expressions of praise or thanks. Brueggemann argues that laments allow God to be newly engaged in a crisis that puts God at risk. With praise or thanks, God isn't expected to do anything. God can remain completely passive. But laments call God to act. They call God to respond. And Fight Club calls God to respond. So Tyler's lament that I cited earlier about God's abandonment is illuminated by a scene that we'll show and we'll turn the volume up, that is not in the film, but it's in the supplemental DVD. And this is the narrator.
Either God's worst enemy or nothing, which would you choose? We're the middle children of history. We have no special purpose or place, and unless we get God's attention, we have no hope of damnation or redemption. Which is worse, hell or nothing? Burn the museums. Wipe your ass with the Mona Lisa. This way, at least God will know your name.
So this clip is actually rooted in Polnick's novel Fight Club, upon which the film is based. And this section in the novel is a little bit longer. Polnick writes, quote, "If you're male and you're Christian and living in America, your father is your model for God. And if you never know your father, if your father bails out or dies or is never at home, what do you believe about God? What you end up doing is you spend your whole life searching for a father and God. How Tyler saw it was that getting God's attention for being bad was better than getting no attention at all. Maybe because God's hate is better than his indifference. If you could be either God's worst enemy or nothing, which would you choose? Unless we get God's attention, we have no hope of damnation or redemption. The lower you fall, the higher you'll fly. The farther you run, the more God wants you back. If the prodigal son had never left home, the fatted calf would still be alive." So Polnick illuminates the motives behind the violence of Fight Club and the antics of Project Mayhem. Tyler's anarchic behavior is rooted in a yearning to get God's attention, and he'd rather be damned by God than neglected. Polnick's allusion to the prodigal son parable that Jesus tells in Luke 15 suggests that the more destructive one becomes, the more one might be loved by God. And Tyler regularly insists throughout the film that self-destruction is a prerequisite for authentic living. He says, only after disaster can we be resurrected. Laments are rooted in human suffering and human experiences of grief, loss, death, dying, and pain. They're the matrices out of which laments emerge. Jesus' cry on the cross is rooted in his own humiliation and suffering. And reflecting on Jesus' death on the cross and his cry, my God, why have you abandoned me?" The Lutheran theologian and pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer writes in World War II, "God would have us know that we must live as men and women who manage our lives without him. The God who is with us is the God who forsakes us," and he refers to Jesus' cry on the cross. Before God and with God, we live without God. God lets himself be pushed out of the world onto the cross. He is weak and powerless in the world, and that's precisely the only way in which he is with us and helps us. In World War II, Bonhoeffer experienced his own share of suffering. His arrest by the Nazi SS was no surprise given his very early vocal criticism of Adolf Hitler starting in 1933 and continuing on when Bonhoeffer became involved in a conspiracy to assassinate Hitler. He was hung on a wire hanger by orders of Himmler in April 1945, 2 weeks before his camp was liberated by the Allies. And so his personal suffering and the suffering that he witnessed of the Jewish people in the Holocaust, in which God doesn't act, God doesn't show up, it allows Bonhoeffer, it seems, to resonate with Jesus' cry on the cross. My God, why have you abandoned me? And to see God's abandonment in his own experience in Nazi Germany. Fight Club functions as a lament not only of divine absence, but also throughout the film of the meaninglessness and bankruptcy of the American dream. So despite or because of experiencing a nice home, a comfortable job, a good paycheck, the narrator is a spiritually dead zombie who meanders through life in a vegetative-like state. And the film roots his internal deadness in his pursuit and attainment of the American dream that turns out for him to be a bankrupt promise. in terms of giving him psychic and spiritual meaning. And the narrator's growth and development is tied to his ability to reject the American dream, to leave his job, to forego his home, to move into a rundown shack. So Fight Club contributes to a theological conversation about lament by suggesting there's an integral connection between the spiritual bankruptcy of the American dream and the perception of God abandoning God's children. That the American dream in some way doesn't give room for people to experience God's presence. And the film is going to argue that lament of God's absence is the fitting response to this dilemma. Thanks.
Okay. Eric?
Okay, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. I'd like to thank all of you for coming, and especially thank my colleagues in the philosophy department, several of whom have been most supportive in my own film studies research. Over the last 3 years, they've allowed me to speak at their annual Film, Faith, and Philosophy seminar. This year, they even invited me to give a public lecture on zombie films, and this was a paper that helped me finally frame and conceptualize a very satisfying project on apocalyptic cinema that's been some years in the making. So the nice thing about being obsessed with one project for several years on end is that even though you accumulate a lot of pages, you are ultimately able to summarize your project in a few main ideas. So tonight, in my 10 minutes here, I'd like to condense my standard rant on film and eschatology into 3 parts. First, a historical observation that I'd like to make. Second, an explanation of the cinematic basis for this observation. And third, what I think is a call to action that I believe naturally stems from the making of the kind of observation I'm going to make. So here's my observation. The modern historical world, by which I mean the world of secular liberalism based on the Enlightenment ideals of rationalism, freedom, and material progress, is rapidly ending. The loss of the American dream. This is just a very common trope in modern historical consciousness. But it's giving way to something that has yet to fully identify itself. So the second part is evidence for this. I would cite not only the profusion of unbelievable news that comes barging into our consciousness every day, but also the cinematic evidence of several subgenres of apocalyptic film. In particular, the Japanese dystopian post-apocalyptic anime, the conventional world-ending disaster flick, and then finally, the recent and phenomenally popular category of zombie apocalypse films. The broad historical context of this idea, which is an attempt to relate film to eschatology, it's adapted from an idea that comes from the psychedelic guru, Terence McKenna. McKenna made the observation that the 20th century has been dominated by the moving image. And while it's true that human history has been stuffed for thousands of years with dreams, visions, hallucinations, apparitions, the 20th century alone gave birth to a technology that allows us to project an image on a screen that gives the visionary the power to turn his or her dream, hallucination, or apparition into something that's objectively apprehendable to anybody watching. So in this way, we've been able to make the interior landscape of any one visionary common property throughout the culture. And then once you can do that, you can turn these public images back into the stuff of individual reflection. So there's a very interesting give and take taking place between the interior and exterior image that only film allows to happen. What I think the film has been able to document best, although not necessarily on purpose, is the aesthetic deficiency in modern historical consciousness. Namely, modern humanity's inability to embrace or even imagine any endpoint to its own historical process. Now, all epics, as Aristotle tells us, have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But the epic narrative of modern history provides only for open-ended progress. And this is provisionally fine for people who believe in material progress and have been able to enjoy its fruits. But for those who have no stake in the modern myth dream of endless prosperity, or simply don't buy into the notion that a world of finite resources can support an ever-expanding global economy, this open-endedness is so profoundly alien and alienating that we're starting to witness many of the world's disenfranchised taking it upon themselves to simply eradicate modern civilization, using every conceivable means of doing so, including warfare, drug abuse, escapism through drug abuse, and even terrorism. Now, what all of us have learned in recent years with the hiccups in the financial world is that deficiencies in the modern narrative affect everybody, and are not merely the particular problem of isolated groups of religious traditionalists or disgruntled losers in the lottery of global capitalism. All of us are passengers in a historical bus that has driven off a cliff. And while the ride and the view may be exciting at the moment, the final landing is going to be jarring, if not catastrophic. And this is a historical problem. This is a serious historical problem. The apocalyptic films that were produced in the late 1990s portrayed this problem with unsettling clarity. Movies such as Armageddon, Deep Impact, Independence Day, to name only a few, depict a stable, self-satisfied modern world that is suddenly forced to contend with an external agent that threatens to wipe out the world as its inhabitants know it. Now, interestingly, in all of these films, in grand Hollywood style, and with perfect modern predictability, the crisis is averted when the entire world rallies to the leadership of the United States, including presidents who fly F-14s, and confronts the asteroid, and the alien ship, and destroys them with the creative application of nuclear weapons. So the message of these movies would seem to be twofold. One, there are no problems that nuclear weapons can't fix, ultimately. And two, that modern civilization did not create this problem. These are bad aliens from outer space, or simply the random acts of an indifferent cosmos. Now, since about 2005, this kind of Y2K disaster genre has given way to a new, and I think more disturbing kind of apocalyptic scenario. When you watch films like Serenity, or V for Vendetta, or Doomsday, I Am Legend, 28 Days Later, we're not dealing with aliens or space junk, but rather with gross dereliction and diabolical mismanagement at the highest levels of government. In each of these movies, some dangerously ambitious medical project has been botched and then covered up, or then even exploited by evil political leaders who take advantage of the suffering and the chaos in order to strengthen their position and impose totalitarian rule upon a frightened population. So the major change in the Y2K genre of apocalyptic films and the more recent films, I would say the films that take us from 2005 to 2009 or so, is that the newer films seem to reflect a growing awareness that maybe, just maybe, we are the chief causes of our own problems, and that the greatest achievements of modern civilization, such things as medicine and rational government, may not ultimately be as great a friend to humanity as we've been led to believe. What doesn't change from era to era is the sense that we're done. This civilization is over, and we're out of ideas. Now, when you look at these films, again, in grand Hollywood fashion, there is something like a happy ending. In V for Vendetta, the Houses of Parliament blow up. Right? The evil leaders are all exposed, their plots are foiled, and the sympathetic protagonists manage to escape danger, and they find themselves, at the gates of the new colony or somewhere in a safe haven. But that's how it ends. And we never see how the post-apocalypse ever really unfolds, because we haven't scripted it yet, because our historical consciousness doesn't provide for it. We don't have any closure built into our historical thinking. And what we have is a very misplaced faith in progress, but absolutely no idea of where it ultimately is supposed to lead us. So seeing these films just coming out and with the very same kind of theme, the very same kind of ending, it really leads me to think that we just don't know what comes next. Now, all we can imagine is doing the same things over and over again. So this brings us, and at first, that's where I kind of landed with this project. I said, okay, all this is showing us that history is over, and we don't know what comes next. But then along comes the zombie film. And it seems it only occurred to me in the recent months as I was writing the final part of this, that the zombie is post-historical, post-Christian humanity. That's who we're going to be. That's who we're becoming. Right? Having enslaved ourselves to a worldview of never-ending material progress in a world of finite resources, we have secured our destiny, and it is zombiehood. We are preparing ourselves to be unthinking, unfeeling, self-absorbed, and insatiable consumers who instinctively gravitate toward malls and entertainment space. And this is pretty much what you see. We're becoming zombies now for the same reason that we became sophisticated, self-satisfied moderns in happier times. And I think the reason is because we thought we could create a world in which God had no place. So the missing element in history, as our films are showing us, is God. God is the missing element. So 3, the last part of this, is the imperative to action, the call to action, and are some of the points that I made in my recent talk a few weeks ago. In order to sidestep this faith that we've scripted for ourselves, or maybe just to soften the impact of it, because I don't think we can actually sidestep it at this point, we must somehow escape the psychic entrapment of materialism. All of these things are much easier said than done. We must somehow embrace historical closure and live our lives, as the Trappist monk Thomas Merton once urged, with the full awareness of the eschatological reality of the ever-present kingdom of God. And we do this, I think, by this third call to action, by taking command of our own power, to create holy and satisfying images. We do it by remembering our dreams, by exploiting our power to incubate dreams, to remember dreams, to interpret dreams, and to transform the interior landscapes of our imagination into something externally real. And this, I think, may be the greatest historical lesson of film, coming as it does at the end of the modern world. That we are all the directors of the movies that we see. And I think we all have to do a better job of bringing into reality the mise-en-scène that we want to inhabit. So that's pretty much my piece. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Well, thanks to our whole panel. We believe in at the Socratic Club in conversation, so we've heard lots of prompts to discussion and controversy. So, as you wish, direct your questions either to the whole panel, or if there's somebody in particular you want to pick a bone with, just go ahead. Go ahead.
Just in listening to the forward speaker, it reminds me of how that academic vocation is a powerful kind of storytelling, and I've appreciated hearing these more powerful stories. So thank you. But I did want to just present, I guess, a case to you, Matt, and hear your response to it. But you were presenting Fight Club as a kind of lament, and I know that the scene that you showed that made the most of your case was actually a commercial for the movie. It wasn't the movie itself, but taking this Christian language and interpreting this as a lament, the film and the writer is drawing on Nietzsche specifically, and we know that Nietzsche is not trying to come up with a Christian lament, rather he's using the language as a kind of polemic. And the film itself seems better to be understood as a struggle between Nietzsche's last man, the bourgeois consumer, who identifies himself by buying at IKEA and trying to define himself by these cultural trappings, and not taking responsibility, always wanting to have somebody give him the story, to Tyler Durden, who's clearly the overman. But the solution that the film comes to is that this last man has to grow up past the overman by recognizing that he's the one who's caused all these problems for Marla. He has to take responsibility for a woman who he has actually put in jeopardy, which is, when you think back to the narrative that Nietzsche gives, it totally flies in the face of Nietzsche's view of masculinity. So you have, at the end, this man who is defining his own masculinity, and obviously we've all seen the film, masculine he's defining his masculinity by caring for a woman at the end and shooting the overman. Okay. Now, I'm presenting this as another way of, and I think one that's more consistent with the film's narrative itself, especially since they purposefully released the film on Nietzsche's birthday, and they're in dialogue with Nietzsche on this. And I wanted to suggest that the reason why that's difficult to see might be a certain narrative hermeneutic that you're approaching this work with, that it seems like you're also approaching the text of Scripture with. So in looking at the Gospels, the mistake of hermeneutic that I'm pointing to is the classic hermeneutic in the 20th century that saw the Gospels as a collection of sayings, that then the academic created a narrative to structure rather than looking at history to allow a narrative, to allow the narrative context to help us understand the sayings. And the evidence that would seem to point to this is the way that you were looking at the texts in the Gospels and the way that you were looking at the quotation by Jesus on the cross. Jesus is on the cross and he's crucified. I've never been crucified, but I would imagine you don't really feel like reciting whole psalms. You know, it's more of a soundbite utterance. You know, it's also hard to breathe and all that. But when Jesus is quoting Psalm 22, I'm sure you're familiar with the latter part of that psalm, right? And is the latter part of the psalm in any way rejecting that God is one who comes and delivers? Is it?
Well, there's a lot of scholarly debate about...
I'm not asking about scholarly debate. I mean, you've read it, right?
Yes.
And you can read the original languages, right?
Yes.
So you know what it says?
Yes.
It's not despair at the end.
Right. Psalm 22 moves from lament to praise and thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And what is the confidence that's expressed in Psalm 22? Isn't it that God's going to deliver this guy, he's going to come back to the congregation, and he's going to minister mercy to them and speak the glories of God among the peoples, right?
The Psalm 22 ends on a note of thanks and praise for God's rescue and deliverance. Yeah.
But I'm talking about the details of the psalm. Isn't that what it says?
Roughly, yes.
Okay, so the narrative arc of that psalm would not be consistent with what you're saying that statement means, correct?
If one is assuming that one line, which is the first line of the psalm, is meant to evoke the entire psalm in its entirety, yes.
So do you think that when Jesus quoted that psalm, he knew what the rest of it said?
There are questions about whether Jesus actually quoted the psalm.
Well, I'm just saying hypothetically, let's suppose he actually did.
Okay.
In the event that he did, and he was lamenting, if he did that, would he have known what the rest of the psalm was talking about? Especially since it's talking about casting lots for his clothes, his arms being pierced, that sort of thing. So he probably knew what it meant, right?
Yeah, Mark certainly did.
I'm saying if Jesus actually said these things,
yes.
Right? In the sense that Bonhoeffer could go ahead and say, I sympathize with him, right? If Jesus actually did say these things, okay, such that we can say that he lamented, would the statement be a lamentation or a confession of his faith that God was going to rescue him?
Right. Well, the question is, with that line, does it refer to the whole rest of the psalm or not? And we think that Luke takes it as a reference, not to the whole psalm, but just that line, and we think that's why he changes the saying.
And that's why I'm raising the question. It sounds like you're taking sayings and putting a narrative on top of that to come up with a reason why Luke didn't mention it.
Right.
And that's what I'm raising this question of. It sounds like you're using a certain narrative hermeneutic that creates what Ricoeur might call a hermeneutics of suspicion.
Yeah, the question is, when that line is cited in Mark 15:34, is it only intended to be that line, or is it intended to evoke the entire psalm? And so people who see it as an evocation of the entire psalm say, it's not a question of God's abandonment, but it's a trust and confidence that God's going to rescue and deliver. Other people who see it as not referring to the entire psalm say, it is a question of God's absence.
Right,
So,
we don't have them here, we have you here.
Right.
Which one is it?
I think it's the latter because of numerous clues in Mark's text. Mark's the only gospel that doesn't give us a resurrection appearance by Jesus. If you end the gospel at 16:8, which is where most scholars think Mark's to end, we think there are a lot of clues that Mark is wanting to present Jesus as a Messiah, and what it means for him to be a Messiah is that he's not a powerful healer or worker of miracles, but that he's someone who suffers and dies. So that's where I come out on Mark's gospel.
So you see, because of the narrative hermeneutic you're using, you see Mark's gospel as a tragic ending. Kind of, it ends on a hopeless note.
No, not necessarily.
But you don't know.
No, because I think Mark ends it that way because of a message he's trying to communicate to Christians in Rome who were suffering under Nero's persecution in 64 CE, and that message of Jesus as one who suffers actually resonates with Christians who were suffering in Rome. So they have a Jesus that has gone through what they are currently going through. So it's actually a message of hope for them.
Someone else? Question? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I actually had a question on, trying to pull it up, to you, sir, on
Yes.
the far end.
Yeah.
You mentioned reconciliation.
Yeah.
And have you heard of a site called Post Secret?
Say it again.
Post Secret. It's this blog spot. It's
I'm not familiar with it.
basically people can go onto this site and post directly onto the site saying it's all anonymous.
Yes.
And so people can essentially they post their deepest and darkest secrets.
Okay.
And my question about that is, do you feel that it's people's drive to reconcile is based off of like some religious urge, or is it just off of a feel-good urge?
Psychological, yeah.
For self.
Yeah.
Because they go through a lot, there's a lot of like, I wish I was dead. Like, sometimes I think 10 ways of killing myself, and there's this lot of like grief and depression and whatnot. So
Yeah, well, as I suggested in the first section, I think the intra-alienation that we have, struggling with our actions, struggling with it, there's a real desire in all human beings to resolve that if they think resolution is possible. I mean, it just deals with the pain, of it. And so whether it's a struggle with something, in the case of the character in the movie, it was his feeling that he had caused the death of his wife. It may not be quite that dramatic. It may be that I have caused the breakup of a relationship by what I have said or what I have done that I cannot get back. And sometimes that brings, really incredible pain and suffering. My suggestion, though, is that the desire for people is to resolve those alienations. We are social creatures, and we need that. And I think there's just a lot of literature out there that reinforces it, whether it's Dostoevsky's literature or Tolstoy and others in literature, but also in film. And we see it over and over again. You talked about this site that I haven't seen, but I can see it meets that need to confess or to talk about some of these things rather than keep them inside. Unfortunately, usually in a New Testament point of view, the importance is confessing that to the person you've offended, and also the promise, 1 John 1:9, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. So there's this Christian hope that confession ultimately leads to reconciliation and also redemption. I'm not saying that all those film writers and directors get that, but I think they do get that there's a need to resolve some of this angst that's going on when there is unresolved reconciliation.
The guy that created Post Secret, he's published a few books.
yeah.
And the rules with Post Secret are that you have to post a secret that you've never told anyone before, ever. So it's something that you've kept to yourself. And he started to group them into different themes in these books. And one of the books focuses specifically on God and religion. And they're quite remarkable, the things that people express in there. And it all started with, he asked people to send him a postcard, write the secret on the postcard, and they could decorate the postcard any way they wanted to, and drop a picture on it.
I think the film City Island that I talked about earlier, it's that same narrative of, it all gets started when the main character, Andy Garcia, is asked in a drama class to share with another actor something he shared with no one else, that's his deepest, darkest secret. And it takes quite a bit of the film till he finally gets the courage to do that. And even though he hesitates to reveal it, it ultimately brings incredible resolution.
I actually had another question. I'm sorry if I forgot your name. Yes, you talked about the zombie culture, zombie apocalypse, and I was curious if you said the way to solve all this was essentially going to God, but if man created the problem, then is the God figure even necessary?
If you think that the problem is the expulsion of God from historical life, yes. I think because what our the theology behind Christianity tells us that humanity can't save itself. If it tries, it will fail. So what we're seeing inside the modern civilization is the fruits of this failed attempt to live a godless life. So I guess what remains is, God is always there, God's always available. So I guess what I'm thinking is, should we embrace a new radical kind of religiosity? And again, I don't really know what this looks like. I have a sense that there's some great grace about to bestow itself upon us, whether we deserve it or not, which will enable all of us to make kinds of decisions inside the historical world that may in fact redeem. But then again, that's just my intuition. But I think God is persistently holding his hand out to us. Whether we take it or not is always our choice. So to answer your question, I would say that we will fail. We will fail. History is proof that we will fail if we try to create heaven on earth, or if we try to create some kind of satisfactory life without reference to God. If that's a good answer to your question.
I have a question that's related to that, and really I'm curious about what anyone on the panel thinks, even though it's directed kind of to a question that you've posed for us, Eric, and that is, if we see in a lot of films, some of the ones that everyone in the panel has made allusion to, we see hints of, I'll use your language here, Eric, we see hints of grace that are injected into human life. And we find it, for example, I'm thinking, since you asked us to think about apocalyptic films, we find it in apocalyptic films like The Book of Eli. But we even find it, Dr. Clayton and I have just been talking a lot about Avatar recently. What we find there, of course, is spirituality that I would argue is incoherent in what it is and how it's to be understood. But there's a sense that we need something. So I wonder if that's a kind of counter to what you're suggesting. And I guess the reason I see this as a broader question for everyone on the panel is we are thinking about God as hidden in film. And the question is, is God hidden in film because there are only hints that are there that we who are inclined to look for will find? Or is it a matter, I guess I can go back to, Michael, your comment earlier, that whether or not the directors and producers and screenwriters and so forth know they're doing this, they're going to inevitably find themselves turning to theological themes. I'm just curious what any of you think about that.
To just answer it right away, I think there's always an element of what we would loosely call spirituality, right, in the modern pop culture, New Agey culture, which, as I'm sure you know or would suspect or agree with, doesn't necessarily have anything to do with religion, or anything to do with placing oneself in obedience to God's will. It's that itself is sort of a self-manufacture. You know, much of what we call spirituality is really an ego conceit. I am God, I can find God within me. And the whole rhetoric of, you know, we are really God if only we would know it. I think that's as delusionalism as pure materialism. In fact, it's a kind of spiritualism. It's materialism posing as spiritualism, and it's been unfortunately one of the currencies of modern life since at least the late 19th century. So what it really is just another attempt to I think turn even the religious life into a material phenomenon. You know, we've seen movies maybe like The Secrets, right, where you can manifest anything, you can visualize it, you can have it all. That raises huge moral questions. And it may be that we can visualize everything and have it all. That may actually be very true. But whether or not we should do that is a question that the New Agey people have not come up with a good answer for. So I think that would be my initial response to that. So even our spirituality is ultimately going to fall short of that metanoia, right, that we might actually need as a civilization to redeem ourselves.
And I would agree that part of the dialogue goes on. There's a movie, Eat, Pray, Love, if you saw that movie. Ultimately, her conclusion was, you know, I am God. And of course, it's a very Eastern idea of that, you know, God is in all of us, or all is God. And a very pantheistic view. But I do believe, and I guess I take this from Scripture itself, that when God made us in His image, we bear that image, whether we deny it or accept it. And even voices like Nietzsche, you know, lean on certain things, absolutes, even to get where they go, even though they end up in rejecting. And I do think that's one of the things we have going for us as a Christian community, is that we can appeal to those things that people innately know is right. And they may not always live it out, they may not always are able to project it to the people that really matter to them, unfortunately, but they really deep down inside know that, and that's what we have going for us. And I think I use the term, before the fall, according to Genesis 1, God said there's no one to till or cultivate the ground. And I use the word cultivate, we get that from culture, is to take what God created and reorder it into all sorts of creative ways. And I really believe that's exactly what culture does all the time. We reorder the basic things that God has given us in wonderful creative ways. And of course, film shows that, as well as all sorts of literature. But I do believe there's that sense, not only that we're lost in ourselves, but we're also, there's something out there that we're searching for.
Yeah, I think part of that question gets to different modes or ways of thinking about God. And how do we discern who God is, how God operates. And, you know, there are different vehicles through which people see God working. So one is Scripture, there's tradition, there's experience, there's reason. Sometimes we will use some of those as grids to evaluate what we see in a film and deem and evaluate and say, does this conform to my standard for what is godly or Christian? There's a Catholic biblical scholar at Emory, Luke Timothy Johnson, who was the Flannery speaker here last year. He defines theology as trying to catch up with what God is doing presently in the world. So the assumption is that God is active in the world, and the task of the theologian is to figure out what is God doing in the world. So he'll put a premium on experience, and that comes from him seeing the Apostle Paul do that, seeing things in experience that might counter his previous notions of who God is, or his understanding of what Scripture says God is.
Man, I have a question that it has to do with, as you talked about using that passage, my God has forsaken me, and I also felt like it was a limited vocalization of Christ's suffering. I mean, he speaks a lot about his suffering throughout his whole life in the Gospels, and tells you this is what's going to happen, even though Peter tries to stop him from that. But then as you look in the New, I just wonder if you didn't study in the theology of suffering of the Apostle Paul, which is an extenuation. And we have lots of material from him too. I think you find Apostle Paul has a real understanding that suffering is inevitable for the Christian, and he uses terms like that I might fulfill the sufferings of Christ. That almost there's an ongoing suffering for the Christian. And I even though I would agree with you that this was a real suffering moment for Jesus, and Hebrews tells us that Christ is perfected through his suffering, but it's not that it's an ultimate lament. The other thing I wondered is the Fight Club scenario where he talks about it's better to be damned by God than to be ignored by him. And I wonder if you've read any literature from, frankly, young men of violence in our culture. Do they have that kind of a theological thing? From many of the young men that I've talked to who've gone through some of that violence and destruction, it's really an anger at their earthly father, and it's, but I'm trying to think about, do they really think that theological about their passion for showing violence, or is it more just of a way of expressing their angst about the fact that they're being forsaken by their dad? And for most young men, it's really a huge thing when a father walks away from a son. And from conversations I have with students, even in the last few weeks.
Yeah, so I think in Fight Club, the narrator begins life like a zombie. He's emotionally, spiritually dead. And his growth through the film is moving towards becoming alive. And there are several things he does to become alive. So he goes to this grief recovery groups, and there he learns to emote and see people who express themselves emotionally. But what the Fight Club does for him is that he experiences pain. Pain is inflicted upon himself. So there's meaning not in inflicting pain on anyone else. So the first assignment that Tyler gives in Fight Club is to go out to pick a fight with someone and to lose. And even when people get too violent in Fight Club towards other people, they're seen as kind of crazy, like they've lost it. And I think what that speaks to is also a culture in which you find people needing to cut themselves. Why? I'm no psychologist, but I think at some level there's a need that people have to feel something that culture writ large isn't giving them, a feeling of aliveness. I think with biblical texts, as a biblical scholar, we're really big on making sure we say, well, this is going on in Mark, this is what's going on in Paul, and we don't want to submerge them into each other. So I think it's possible that they have very different attitudes about suffering. I think Mark and Luke clearly have different attitudes about it.
So you're seeing the text as being very separate from one another. This is not a unified voice in the New Testament about suffering that we can kind of collect and put together, but it's actually separate voices. So the Mark's text is a voice that really says it's more parallel with the Fight Club message.
No, not necessarily. Well, we want to see each voice as distinct.
Okay.
So if David and Heather each write an essay about the same topic, I want to listen to each of their voices on their own terms, in their own voice, and not collapse them into a messy middle.
Okay.
But you're right about, I think, Paul's attitude towards suffering in Hebrews, and
I just wondered if you thought about that, comparing them, since you put such emphasis on the words of Christ, if you thought about broadening that out, and what implications maybe the subject of Fight Club would have with in contrast with the conversations that Paul gives us about suffering.
I have a question. As we're talking, you had said something about the need to feel that maybe is getting worked out in culture, but then we have this number one prescription drug is the antidepressants, right? The need to buffer ourselves from feeling. And so, and then to your question about violence, there's also the economic piece, right? If you have nothing, you have your masculinity, right? If you have nothing, you have your femininity. You can beat people up. You can, be attractive. And so those are interesting things to lay on as we think about gang violence or, absence of father, sure, but what about the economic question? Because in the American dream, you promise social mobility, but not a spirit. I don't know the spiritual dimension of the social mobility in the American dream.
Well, we have reached our hour and a half, and thanks to everyone. Let's thank our panel, please.